Hello and welcome to our weekly Bible study. My name is James, and we're going through the life of Jesus Christ through the lens of the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 14. And this is the section, just a small section today, where Peter denies Jesus. Jesus had warned him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter, like any of us, is thinking when Jesus tells him this is never going to happen. He says, it's not going to happen. I am with you to the death. Never gonna happen. But we kind of have cheated. We know the end of the story. It does happen. So today we'll look at how it happens. We'll look at why Peter says what he does. But I also want to look at why Peter is an example, not just of moments where we blow it in this text, but also why Peter is in this text, in this very event, his probably the worst moment of his life, an example of bravery, of courage, and maybe of more dedication than we give him credit for. So, grab your Bible and let's dive right in. All right, let's read the text together. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. And when the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. And again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So I want to start with who Peter was and his personality. He is a fisherman. He's grown up in the small town in Galilee, and he is a hard-working, blue-collar, faithful Jewish man. And more importantly for us in this study, he is one of the first people called to come and to follow Jesus. And he answers that call, and he is faithful to Jesus all throughout Jesus' ministry up to this moment. In all of those times, we get to know some things about his personality. Peter is somebody who sometimes, he puts his foot in his mouth. He speaks up very quickly because he's got things on his heart. He's got things on his mind. He wants to say them. He is a passionate guy, and he's passionate about his faith in Jesus. He's passionate about his dedication to the kingdom, and sometimes he bites off a little more than he can chew. Now, I don't know about you, but I can relate to that. Sometimes I put my foot in my mouth. That's what I'm saying. But Peter's more than that. He is a man who has courage and conviction. When Jesus walks out on the water to Peter and the other disciples in the boat, Peter is the one, and he's the only one, who says, if you're really him, why don't you let me walk out to you? And then he gets out of the boat and he walks on water. Now, most of the time we focus on the fact that he starts to drown because he looks around at the wind and the waves and he gets scared, and his faith takes a back seat to his fear, and I think we can all relate to that too. And he sinks. But as he sinks, he does something that I find admirable. He does not do what many of us would do. He does not try to just swim back to the boat by himself and say, well, I'm never doing that again. Instead, he cries out, oh Lord, save me. Wise, even in his moment of fear, even in his failure, he was a person who often was still a man of faith, and still a man who knew, okay, I've blown it, I need to get back to Jesus. Okay? And that's going to come into today's story very strongly. Okay, but over and over again we do see him kind of bravely step out. Nobody else stepped out of the boat, only Peter. Nobody else in this moment follows Jesus. John helps him get in a little bit, but then John seems to disappear through all of these events, while Peter stays and is with Jesus up until the rooster crows. Yeah, that's right. He was with Jesus until the rooster crows. It's important for us to remember that because anybody else would have already run, but not Peter. Peter follows Jesus in the courtyard. He wants to keep an eye on what's going on, and he knows there is great risk to himself. That's why he ends up denying. I'm not justifying it. It's what happened. But he does want to be there with Jesus, so he follows. And of course it's nighttime, and they're around a fire, and it's maybe an easier place to kind of lurk in the shadows, and here there seem to be a lot of people around. And so he thinks he can just kind of stay there on the periphery and know what's going on. Now we should be thankful that Peter did, because Peter is the eyewitness to what goes on with Jesus in these moments, who shares with Mark. That's what we understand from Christian history and tradition, that Mark got his information mostly from Peter. And so Peter is why we even know what happened as all of this kangaroo court and events goes down. He was able to follow and listen from a distance. So he stays close. He doesn't want to get caught. And so when the first accusation comes up, he kind of just plays coy, right? He says, I don't know what you're talking about. And maybe you've had the same experience where you've been afraid to let somebody know a connection you have or something like that, and you've just played it off, I don't know. It's not right. It's not honest. I'm not condoning what Peter did or when anybody else has done it, but you've probably either had it happen to you or maybe in a weak moment you've done the same thing. That's how he plays this off the first time. It's just kind of a weaker denial of, I'm not sure I understand who you're talking about, even though it was impossible for him not to know. And the girl doesn't have it, okay? She goes about her business, but it's not very long, it seems, before she comes back around and says, no, I know you're that guy. You were with him. You were with that Nazarene. Jesus, you're one of those guys. And again, he said, no, I do not know the man. And of course, this time it's a much more direct, much more dishonest denial. He just says, I don't know it. Now, before I go on to the people around who are seeing this happen, I do want to stop again and say, but Peter is still braver than most of us are. William Barclay, in his commentary, brings this up, that 999 out of 1,000 men would not have even been sitting at that fire. They would have fled long ago, and you kind of have proof of that. There are 11 disciples. Only 2 of them actually went to this location. John snuck Peter in, and at this point it seems Peter is the only one left. Those are about the same ratio. Most men would have hightailed it out of there and been gone. Too risky, not going to get that close. I'll read about it in the paper tomorrow. Okay, that's where most people would be. And so I think Barclay's right in pointing out Peter is still a brave man, a courageous man, even in this moment, even in what is his greatest failure. But back to the crowd. The crowd starts to catch on. This girl is not letting it go, and she's probably a credible witness. She works there for one of the officials, one of the chief priests, okay? She's around the temple a lot. Peter has been with Jesus at the temple, not just that day, not just that week. He's been there a lot, and it was a prominent place, and Jesus was a prominent person, and by now people are starting to recognize everybody that had been hanging around Jesus a little bit too much. They know she's probably right. He's probably one of Jesus' disciples. And so then the crowd joins in and says, no, you are one of those guys. We can hear it in your accent. You're a Galilean. He's a Galilean. All those guys are from Galilee. You are one of his disciples, aren't you? She's right. And it actually was more than just a simple sentence. When you put all 4 Gospels, because all 4 Gospels relay this event, you even have a relative of Malchus, the guy that Peter had sliced the ear off of in the garden. And he says, I think I know you. I think I've seen you back at the garden, which is really probably a pretty polite way of accusing, because even though it was dark and they were just seeing by the light of torches, he probably knows the guy who cut off his relative's ear. right? I think you would know the person who cut off your relative's ear that evening. It wasn't even a long time ago. So now Peter feels pressure doubled down, and his fear really starts to get even more a hold of him. He has been brave. He has been courageous, even though he has been careful to a fault. To a fault. He's been dishonest, and he's denied Jesus. We're not going to lighten that up. We're not going to play that off. It's very important. But it's also important that through all of these accusations, Peter had stayed until this one. On the third accusation, with now a crowd of people gathering around him, Peter not only says, I don't know him. Peter, in frustration, gets desperate. We are never at our best when instead of being controlled by our faith, when instead of sticking to our courage, we start to be controlled by fear, and even more, by desperation. We make our worst mistakes in desperation. And this is where Peter is. And so he starts calling down curses and swearing. Now this is not like he's cussing and swearing. He's calling down curses and swearing. And I've heard it explained before that what he was doing was cussing to show that, by using profane language, that he couldn't have been with Jesus. Well, that's not what's going on here. And whether or not that happened, there's nothing that says that. What it says is that he called down curses on himself. And that's kind of like the thing of, I swear on my mother's grave, that sort of a thing. Or, may it be done to me as. And that was a phrase they would use when they were making a contract, or when they were swearing, or when they were trying to prove they were telling the truth. They might point to an animal that's being slaughtered and say, may it be done to me as that animal is being slaughtered if I'm not telling you the truth. That sort of a thing. May I die 1,000 deaths if I'm not telling you the truth. It's a very pagan, very Roman way of doing things, and this is what he does. And then he swears, I do not know the man. Remember, Jesus had told him, do not swear. Do not swear by the temple. Do not swear by things in heaven or by earth. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. And Peter violates that in this moment, both by his dishonesty and by the fact that he is swearing to his honesty, which is actually not honesty. So, that's what it means. Not like he's using profanity. Whether he did that or not, we don't know. But it's actually deeper than that. He goes so far as to say, like kids on a playground, I swear on my mother's grave, I don't know the man. And it's not true. And at that moment, the rooster crows. Now this rooster crow can mean a couple of things. There is the literal traditional interpretation a lot of the time that we will hear that it's a rooster, and a rooster crowed. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Okay? It sounds to me, especially in John's gospel, like it was a literal rooster. However, some folks who know the history and things of the time better than I will tell you, Barclay in his commentary, he's one of those guys. What they say is that this is a reference to, and it could be, a reference to a Roman trumpet blowing for the changing of the guard, which would have been occurring at the same time of day and the time of morning that all of this is happening. So it lines up with the time of day, and there's credible reason to think that maybe those scholars who say this is what's happening is happening. They would blast a trumpet, and they would blast that trumpet, maybe give a warning call ahead, and then one more call to say, okay, here we are, it's time. That they would blast the trumpet at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they would blast the trumpet again at 6 o'clock in the morning, and those were guard changes, because the changes were 3 hours, so they were like 9 to midnight, midnight to 3, and 3 to 6. And yeah, that may be exactly what was going on. Maybe instead of hearing a rooster, he heard the trumpet blast. Now, a reason you might say, well, I think I know the difference between a trumpet and a rooster, but what the Romans called that trumpet that blew at 3 and at 6 was the cock crow, the rooster crow. So, there might be some credibility to that. It's not a big deal. It's just kind of interesting to think that maybe There are sounds associated with this, a rooster crowing or the trumpet blast of the changing of the guard. What it tells us is, if it was that trumpet blasting, is it helps us have markers for the times and kind of a reinforcement that we know even down to the hours that all these conversations were happening. So it's kind of important from that point of view. But the most important part of it is this. Jesus had told Peter this would happen. He knew it would happen. And he said, Peter, before the rooster crows that second time, which would be the 6 o'clock, you will have denied me 3 times. May it never be, Peter says, but it was. At the moment of that crow or of that blast, whichever the case may be, Peter breaks down. He leaves. The Gospels tell us, when we see the fuller picture of all 4 Gospels, he runs out by himself and he weeps bitterly. He knows not only that he failed, but I think maybe one reason he was there, one reason he was so brave to be there, was that he wanted to prove he would stay with him till his death. He wanted to prove that he was not going to be the man who denied Jesus 3 times. That must have slammed his heart so incredibly deeply. There's no way around the failure of the moment. And so often in our lives where we find ourselves in the same place as Peter, where there's no way around the fact that whatever it is we have, despite our courage, despite our great pledges of faith, despite our New Year's resolutions, we're coming up on those soon, we failed and we've blown it. Maybe it's not as big as Peter's, maybe it's bigger than Peter's. Doesn't really matter. The bottom line is we know at times we've blown it and we really are cut to the heart and we don't know where to go from there. Peter goes back to his boats. He goes into hiding. He goes deeper into his fear. But it's not the end of the story. And if there's anything we need to get out of this, it's that. Our failures are never the end of the story. When this happened, this last denial, Jesus' eyes met with Peter's and drove home, Peter, 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 Peter. I think that's why he wept as bitterly as he did. I think it's why he ran. If he had stayed the other 2 times, he didn't stay this time. It was too much. What we need to learn from Peter's greater story and his reinstatement by Jesus is this. Our biggest failures are never the end of our story. As you look back on the last year, you look back on high points and low points, remember that. The high points really are there. Those moments of faithfulness really are there. So are the failures. Learn from them. Grow from them. For Peter, this was a growing moment. Nothing changed Peter like this moment. Never again does Peter deny Jesus. Now, Peter will make mistakes. You can read about one of them in the book of Galatians where Paul calls him out on one of them, a pretty big one. But never does Peter ever live in slavery to his fear to this level again. It steels his resolve. It strengthens his backbone. And Peter becomes the champion of the kingdom of God that is our hero. But he only got there through this failure. Whatever it is that you feel like is like this for you, let God turn it into your resolve. Let Jesus turn it into your moment of grace that becomes a turning point in your testimony of who Jesus is and what he's done in your life. Because these moments are just as important as those Rocky Mountain highs. They're just as important. And sometimes they're the ones that become most important for shaping us into the men and women of faith that God wants us to be. For Peter, that's what happened. That day, he hit rock bottom. That day, it was all up from there. He grew from there. He strengthened from there. He gave witness to Jesus from there and gave his life from that moment on He made true the words, "I will follow you to my death." And he did. And his life is a testament to grace and glory and courage, even after moments of failure and fear. I pray that you find strength in Jesus just as he did in the days that followed. I pray that you find joy in Jesus just as he did in his future. And if you'd like to join us for worship, I pray that you will come and join us for worship this Sunday at the Early Church of Christ at 10 o'clock. God bless you. Have a great week.